Elliot Vance was not the kind of boy that anyone noticed, and that was exactly how he liked it. He was 17 years old, skinny as a metal rod, and had the kind of pale face that looked like it had never seen real sunlight. Mostly true, because he spent every free hour buried in stolen alien datapads reading about creatures he would probably never see in person. He lived on Callan 4, a junk moon orbiting a dead gas giant at the edge of civilized space, in a frontier colony called Dusthaven that was exactly as miserable as its name suggested. Dusthaven was a place where broken ships came to die and broken people came to hide, and Elliot fit right in, because he was a little bit of both. The galaxy in the year 2347 was a crowded and complicated place ruled by species that were stronger and smarter and older than humans by 1,000 generations, and humanity occupied a very specific place in that order, which was the bottom. Galactic Concord, politely called a developing species, and what everyone else called soft, weak, fragile, emotional, short-lived, and not worth thinking about. Elliot knew all of this because he read everything he could get his hands on, and what he read about most was aliens, their bodies, their cultures, their animals, their biology, and especially the creatures that most species were too afraid to study up close. The other kids in Dusthaven called him a freak for it, and the alien traders who passed through the colony laughed at him when he tried to ask them questions. But Elliot did not care, because knowledge was the only thing in his life that had never let him down. On the day everything changed, he was out in the orbital scrapyard beyond the colony fence, picking through the carcasses of junked cargo ships for anything he could sell. The scrapyard stretched for miles in every direction, a graveyard of rusted metal and shattered hulls under a sky that was always gray, and Elliot moved through it with the ease of someone who had been doing this since he was old enough to carry a bag. He was halfway through gutting an old Telari freighter when he heard it. A sound so faint that at first he thought he imagined it. It came again, a thin, broken whimpering, like something very small was in a lot of pain. And it was coming from inside a sealed cargo pod half buried in a pile of scrap about 30 meters away. Elliot stood very still and listened, and the sound came a third time, weaker now, and something in his chest tightened in a way he could not explain. He crossed the distance carefully, checking for unstable debris, and when he reached the pod, he saw that it had been welded shut from the outside, not just locked, but deliberately sealed with the kind of heavy bonding that was meant to make sure whatever was inside would never get out. That should have been his first warning. He used his cutting tool, break the seal, and it took him almost 20 minutes, because whoever had sealed this pod had not wanted it opened, and the whole time that weak little sound kept coming from inside, getting softer and softer, like whatever was making it was running out of time. When the seal finally broke and the door groaned open, the smell hit him first. Stale air and old blood and something else, something sharp and electric, like ozone before a storm. Then he saw it, chained to the back wall of the cargo pod with heavy energy-bonded restraints, was a creature about the size of a large dog, curled in on itself, trembling, starving, barely alive. It had 6 legs folded beneath a body covered in fur so black it seemed to swallow the light, and running through that dark fur were veins of bioluminescence, thin lines of silver that pulsed weakly like a dying heartbeat. 4 amber eyes, half closed and glazed with pain, turned slowly to look at him. Elliot stopped, breathing. He knew what this was. He had read about these creatures in every xenobiology pad he had ever owned, had stared at holographic images of them with the kind of awe that other boys saved for sports stars or starship pilots. This was a Varkan wolf, a sacred apex predator of the Varkathi Empire, one of the most feared and powerful civilizations in the known galaxy. Varkan wolves were not pets. They were not animals in any way that humans understood the word. They were living weapons bonded to Varkathi warriors through ancient rituals, and they were never ever found outside Varkathi space. To possess one without authorization was a death sentence in 14 different legal systems. Elliot's legs told him to run, but his eyes would not leave the creature, and as he stood there frozen, he noticed something else that made his blood go cold. The walls of the cargo pod were covered in scorched markings, symbols burned into the metal in precise patterns that he recognized from his reading. They were Ashkai death seals. The Ashkai were a fanatical sect within the Varkathi Empire, who believed in the purity of the Varkun bloodline, and a death seal meant that this creature had been formally condemned, judged impure, and left here to starve and die alone in the dark. And then Elliot understood why. The bioluminescent veins were silver. In every image he had ever seen, in every study he had ever read, Varkun wolves had golden veins, always gold, and silver was a mutation so rare that most Varkathi scholars considered it a myth. To the Ashkai, it was not a myth. It was a curse, an abomination, something to be destroyed. They had chained a baby to a wall and sealed her in a tomb because she was born different. Something inside Elliot broke, the kind of breaking that is actually a door opening. He stepped forward. The creature should have snarled, should have snapped at him with crystalline teeth that could cut through steel, should have done any of the 100 violent things that a Varkun wolf was supposed to do when a stranger approached. She did not. She whimpered, soft and desperate and afraid, and pressed her head toward his outstretched hand, like he was the first kind thing she had ever known. Her silver veins pulsed once, twice, and then began to glow brighter, matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. Elliot felt warmth spread through his chest, strange and deep and overwhelming, like something inside him was reaching out to meet something inside her. And when her cold nose pressed against his chest, directly over his heart, he felt a click that was not a sound, but a feeling, as if two broken pieces had just found each other. He did not know the word for what had just happened. The Varkathi called it the Korvan, the soul bond, and it had never once in the entire recorded history of the galaxy happened between a Varkun wolf and a human being. He just knew that he was never going to leave her here. He pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around her trembling body, worked the energy restraints with shaking hands until they released, and lifted her carefully against his chest, and she weighed almost nothing because she had been starving for so long. "I have got you," he whispered into the dark fur of her neck. "I have got you, and no one is going to hurt you again." He carried her out of the scrapyard and smuggled her through the colony fence and into his tiny hab unit, and that night he fed her nutrient paste from his own rations, and cleaned her wounds, and stayed awake watching her breathe, making sure every breath was followed by another. He named her Nyx, after the ancient human goddess of night, because she was dark and beautiful, and the whole universe seemed afraid of her. But Elliot was not afraid. He was terrified of what would happen when someone found out. The Ashkai and the Varkathi Empire, and the death that was surely coming for both of them. But he was not afraid of her, and as Nyx curled tighter against his chest, and her silver veins glowed steady and warm in the darkness of his small room, Elliot Vance, the nerdy boy that nobody noticed, made a silent promise that he intended to keep, even if it killed him. She would live. 3 months passed, and Nyx grew like a storm gathering strength. When Elliot first carried her out of that cargo pod, she had been small enough to cradle in his arms, but now she was the size of a panther, all lean muscle and black fur, and 6 legs that moved with a silence that should have been impossible for something so large. Her crystalline teeth had come in fully, rows of translucent blades that could slice through metal sheeting like paper, and the fur along her spine could harden in an instant into plates of natural armor that no human weapon could pierce. She was, by every scientific measure Elliot had ever read, one of the most dangerous living creatures in the galaxy. She was also, at this exact moment, lying on her back on his bed, with all 6 legs in the air, while he scratched her belly. "You are ridiculous," Elliot told her, and Nyx made a low, rumbling sound in her chest that vibrated through the entire bed frame, which was her way of saying she did not care what he thought, as long as he kept scratching. The bond between them had deepened in ways that Elliot was still trying to understand. It had started as a warmth in his chest, a vague awareness of her presence and her mood. But over the weeks, it had grown into something much more. He could feel her emotions now, not as thoughts, but as physical sensations, a low vibration in his ribs when she was content, a sharp tightness in his throat when she was anxious, a spreading heat behind his eyes when she was angry. And she could feel him just as clearly. When Elliot was sad, which was more often than he would ever admit, Nyx would press her massive head against his side and hold it there until the feeling passed. And when he was afraid, she would position herself between him and whatever had frightened him, with a stillness that said very clearly that nothing was getting through her. He had read everything the datapads had to say about Varkathi bonding, and what amazed him was how much the Varkathi got wrong about their own wolves. The warrior handlers of the Empire treated the bond as a tool, a leash of emotion that let them command their wolves in battle, and the training methods were built on dominance and control, bending the wolf's will until it obeyed without question. Elliot did none of that. He talked to her, and he knew that sounded stupid, but it was the truth. He just talked to her like she was a person, explained what he was doing and why, asked her what she wanted, watched her body language the way his datapads had taught him, the angle of her ears and the pattern of her bioluminescent veins, and the position of her 6 legs, which each meant something different. When she did not want to do something, he did not force her. He asked differently, or he waited, or he figured out what was bothering her and fixed it. And because of this, because he treated her not as a weapon to be controlled, but as a being to be understood, the bond between them reached a depth that no Varkathi handler had achieved in 1,000 years of trying. He did not know this yet, but he would. The real problem was keeping her hidden. His HAB unit was small, barely 2 rooms, and Nyx was getting bigger every week, and she had a habit of knocking things over with her tail when she got excited, which was every time Elliot came home. He had rigged a sound dampener from scrapyard parts to cover the noise, and he had adjusted his scavenging schedule so he could bring back enough food for both of them, which meant he was eating less himself, though he tried not to think about that. The colony of Dusthaven was not a place where people asked too many questions, which helped, but it was also not a place where secrets stayed hidden forever. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday. Elliot was in the colony market, trading scrap components for food credits, when he felt a sudden spike of cold fear through the bond, sharp and immediate. Nyx's fear, not his own, and he dropped everything and ran. He found her pressed flat against the floor of his HAB unit, all 6 legs tucked beneath her, her silver veins dimmed to almost nothing, and she was staring at the wall that faced the colony's main street, with her 4 amber eyes wide and fixed. She was hiding. Elliot had never seen her hide from anything. He moved to the window carefully and looked out, and his stomach dropped. Walking through the main street of Dusthaven were 3 figures that did not belong there, tall and broad, easily 8 feet each, wearing armor made of something that looked like living bone fused to their skin, their faces marked with ritual scars and patterns that Elliot recognized immediately. Varkathi warriors. And not just any Varkathi, these were Ashkai. He could tell by the Death Seal brands on their forearms, the same symbols that had been scorched into the walls of the cargo pod where he had found Nyx. They were searching for something. They moved through the market with the casual arrogance of predators in a place where nothing could challenge them, stopping colonists to ask questions, scanning buildings with handheld devices. their eyes sweeping every corner with a practiced intensity that told Elliot they had done this many times before. They were looking for Nyx. He sat down on the floor next to her and put his hand on her head and felt her trembling through the bond, a deep cellular terror that was not just fear of being caught, but fear of being returned to that dark pod, that chain, that slow death in the silence. "They are not going to find you," he whispered. "I promise." But promises were easy, and the HFY were still out there. Over the next 2 weeks, they came back again and again, sometimes 3 of them, and sometimes 6, and each time Nyx went silent and dark, and pressed herself into the bottomless, smallest space she could find, while Elliot watched from the window with his heart hammering. He started studying them the way he studied everything, obsessively and thoroughly, noting their patrol patterns and their scanning equipment and their behavioral habits, and he cross-referenced everything with his datapads until he understood how they searched and where they searched, and most importantly, what they could not detect. The scanning devices tracked bioluminescent signatures, which meant Nyx's instinct to dim her veins when frightened was actually saving them. But the scanners were getting more precise each visit, and Elliot knew it was only a matter of time. The confrontation he feared came on a night when he was walking back from the scrapyard. An HFY scout stepped out of an alley and blocked his path, a massive figure in bone plate armor with 4 ritual scars across his face and eyes the color of burned copper. The warrior looked down at Elliot the way a person might look at an insect on the ground, with a complete and total absence of interest or respect. "Human," the HFY said, and the word sounded like something you would scrape off your boot. "We seek a creature, a Varkun whelp, silver-marked and condemned. Have you seen such a thing in this waste heap you call a colony?" Elliot's mouth went dry, and his hands shook, and his mind went completely blank for 3 terrible seconds. Then he swallowed and shook his head and said, "No, sir, I have not seen anything like that. What is a Varkun?" And he made his voice as stupid and confused as possible, which was not hard, because he was so scared he could barely think. The HFY stared at him for a long moment, and then the warrior laughed, a short, brutal sound like rocks breaking, because of course this pathetic little human had not seen a Varkun wolf. Humans could not even bond with their own domestic animals properly, let alone recognize a sacred predator of the wolf. Varkathi Empire. The HFY walked away without another word, and Elliot stood in that alley until his legs stopped shaking, which took a very long time. That night he lay on his bed, with Nyx curled against him, her head on his chest, and her silver veins pulsing softly in the dark. And he was almost asleep when something happened that he was not prepared for. Images flooded his mind, not his own thoughts, but hers. Memories pushed through the bond with a clarity that took his breath away. He saw a world of red stone and purple sky, vast and ancient, with mountains that touched the clouds and forests of crystalline trees that sang when the wind blew through them. He saw a great palace carved into the side of a cliff, and in its highest chamber a female Varkun wolf, massive and golden-veined and magnificent, howling with a grief so deep that the walls cracked around her. Nyx's mother, crying for her stolen child, and then the final image, the one. That made Elliot sit up in the dark, with his heart pounding. A face, not HFY, but something far worse, a Varkathi High Lord in ceremonial robes, seated on a throne of black stone, giving the order with a wave of his hand, like he was swatting away something unpleasant. The order to chain a baby in a box and leave her to die. This was not a rogue cult acting on its own. This went all the way to the top. Elliot sat in the dark for a long time, one hand on Nyx's head, feeling the weight of what he now knew. He was a 17-year-old human boy on a junk moon with no weapons and no power and no allies, and he was up against the ruling class of one of the most dangerous empires in the galaxy. He should have been paralyzed with fear. Instead, for the first time in his life, Elliot Vance was angry. And anger, as the galaxy would soon learn, was a very dangerous thing to give a human who read too much. The HFY came back in force on a cold morning, when the sky above Callan 4 was the color of old iron. 6 warriors this time, not scouts but a full hunting party, each one armed with weapons that could cut through starship hulls, and with them came something worse. A bloodhound construct. Elliot watched from his window as the thing moved through the colony gates, a biomechanical nightmare the size of a horse, all exposed muscle and metal plating, fused together, with a head that was mostly mouth and sensors designed to track Varkon bioluminescent signatures across a planet. It did not walk so much as flow, each step precise and hungry, and the colonists scrambled out of its way like water parting around a stone. Within an hour, Dusthaven was locked down. The HFY called it a quarantine inspection, claimed they were searching for a dangerous biological contaminant, and nobody questioned them, because nobody questioned the Varkathi about anything, ever. That was one of the first rules of surviving in the galaxy. No ships in or out, no communication off-world, every building subject to search. Elliot sat on the floor of his hab unit, with his back against the wall, and his hands on his knees, and tried to think. Nyx was pressed against his side, her silver veins completely dark, her breathing shallow and controlled, and through the bond he could feel her fear, like ice water in his veins. But beneath the fear, there was something else, a fierce burning defiance that he realized was coming from both of them at once. His emotions and hers, tangled together so tightly, he could not tell where one ended and the other began. He could not fight them, that was obvious. He was 130 pounds of bones and anxiety, and he had never thrown a punch in his life. He could not run because the colony was sealed, and even if it was not, he had nowhere to go. He could not hide forever, because the bloodhound construct would find Nyx eventually, maybe in hours, maybe in days, but it would find her. So he did the only thing Elliot Vance knew how to do. He picked up his datapads, and he started reading. He read for 6 hours straight, cross-referencing files he had collected over years of obsessive study. Varkathi legal codes, and historical precedents, and cultural traditions, and religious texts, and military protocols. And Nyx lay beside him with her head on his leg, and waited, with a patience that no Varkathi warrior would have believed possible from a Varkan wolf. The answer came to him at 3 in the morning. He found it buried in an ancient legal text that was so old it was written in High Varkathi, a formal language that most modern Varkathi did not even bother to learn anymore. The Right of Korvan Challenge. It was a law older than the empire itself. From a time when the Varkathi were still tribal, and the bond between warrior and wolf was the most sacred thing in their civilization. The law stated that if a bonded pair was threatened, the bondmate had the right to invoke a formal challenge, a trial of worthiness, that would determine whether the bond was true and whether the pair deserved the protection of Varkathi law. The key was this: once invoked, the challenge could not be refused, not by warriors, not by priests, not even by the HFY, because refusing it meant admitting that your faith in your own traditions was weaker than the challenger's claim, and that was the single greatest dishonor in Varkathi culture. No one had invoked the right in over 500 years. No alien species had ever invoked it at all. Elliot read the passage 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly, and then he started laughing, a quiet, desperate sound that was half terror and half wild hope. He needed to broadcast the challenge on an open Varkathi military frequency, in High Varkathi, formally and correctly, with every ritual phrase in the right order, or it would not count. He could not do this alone. Mira Chen lived 4 hab units down, and she was the closest thing Elliot had to a friend, which was not saying much, because their friendship mostly consisted of her calling him weird, and him asking her to fix things. She was 19, built like someone who had been lifting engine parts since she could walk, with short black hair and oil-stained hands, and a mouth that could make a dock worker blush. And she was the best mechanic in Dusthaven by a significant margin. When Elliot knocked on her door at 4 in the morning, she opened it with a wrench in her hand and murder in her eyes. "This better be life or death, Vance." "It is," he said. "Can I come in? I need to show you something, and you are probably going to want to sit down." 10 minutes later, Mira was sitting on her bed staring at Nix, who was sitting on the floor staring back at her, and the silence in the room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. "That," Mira said very slowly, "is a Varkun wolf." "Yes," Elliot replied. "In your HAB unit?" "Yes." "A Varkun wolf, as in the sacred murder beasts of the Varkathi Empire, the species that literally conquers planets. That Varkun wolf?" "Her name is Nix," Elliot said. Mira put her face in her hands for a long moment, and when she looked up again, she said, "You absolute idiot." But she said it in the voice she used when she had already decided to help, and was just angry about it. He explained everything: the cargo pod, the deck seal, the Ashkai, the bond, the Korvan, all of it, and when he was finished, he told her about the Rite of Korvan challenge and what he needed her to do. "You want me to build a transmitter powerful enough to broadcast on a Varkathi military frequency," she said. "Yes." "From scrapyard parts?" "Yes. In a colony that is currently locked down by 6 alien super soldiers and a biomechanical tracking monster." "Yes." "And you are going to broadcast a formal legal challenge in an ancient alien language that you taught yourself from stolen datapads." "Yes." Mira looked at Nix, who tilted her massive head and let out a soft rumble that vibrated the floor. And then she looked back at Elliot with an expression that was somewhere between disbelief and something that might have been respect. "Fine," she said, "but when this gets us killed, I am haunting you forever." They worked through the night and into the next day, Mira building the transmitter from components she pulled from junked ships, while Elliot wrote and rewrote the challenge text, checking every word against his datapads, making sure the High Varkathi was perfect, because a single error would invalidate the whole thing. The Bloodhound construct was getting closer. Elliot could feel Nix's rising tension through the bond, like a wire being pulled tighter and tighter. And twice they had to go silent when Ashkai patrols passed within meters of Mira's HAB unit. By evening the transmitter was ready, and so was the text. Elliot sat in front of the device, with the written challenge in his hands, and looked at Mira, and then at Nix, and then back at the transmitter, and he was so scared his vision was blurring at the edges. "If I do this, there is no going back," he said. "There was no going back the second you took her out of that pod," Mira said, and she was right. Elliot opened the channel. He spoke in High Varkathi, a language of deep growling consonants and sharp rising vowels that should have sounded strange coming from a human throat, but instead sounded clear and precise and absolutely correct. He identified himself as Elliot Vance of Earth, bonded Korvan mate to a Varkun wolf of silver vein, and he invoked the ancient rite of Korvan challenge against the Ashkai sect and any who denied the truth of his bond. He spoke for 4 minutes without stopping, and he did not make a single mistake. When he finished, the silence on the frequency lasted for almost 30 seconds. Then every Varkathi comm channel in the sector exploded. The broadcast was picked up by military vessels, trading ships, listening posts, and relay stations across 100 light-years. And within an hour, it had reached the Varkathi homeworld itself. A human had invoked the sacred rite. A human claimed Korvan with a Varkun wolf. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Disbelief and outrage and confusion, and something that a few quiet voices in the halls of power recognized as fear. Because if this claim was real, then everything the galaxy believed about humans was wrong. On Callan 4, the Ashkai hunting party received the broadcast and stopped dead. Vorath Kale, their commander, a warrior who had killed more enemies than he could count, stood in the middle of Dusthavens. Main Street, with his fists clenched so tight, his bone plate armor cracked. Because he knew the law. He could not refuse the challenge, and if he tried, the dishonor would destroy him and his sect. He was trapped, and he knew it. And the trap had been set by a boy who could not even lift a sword. 2 days later, a shadow fell across Dusthaven, as a Varkathi warship, the size of a small city, dropped out of hyperspace above Callan 4. It did not carry the markings of the Ashkai. It bore the ancient silver banner of the Korvan judiciary, the neutral arbiters of bond law, who answered to no lord and no sect and no power in the empire, and who had not been called to active duty in 500 years. A shuttle descended to the colony, and from it emerged a towering female Varkathi in robes of gray and silver, her face unreadable, her eyes ancient and sharp, and behind her walked 4 judiciary guards, carrying ceremonial weapons that were very much not ceremonial. She found Elliot standing in the doorway of his HAB unit, pale and thin and shaking slightly, with a Varkhan wolf the size of a panther pressed against his leg, silver veins glowing defiantly bright. The judge looked down at them for a very long time. Then she spoke, and her voice carried the weight of centuries. "Show me your bond, little human, and pray that it is real." Elliot swallowed hard, put his hand on Nix's head, and felt the bond pulse warm and steady between them like a second heartbeat. "It is real," he said quietly, "and I can prove it." The interior of the Varkathi judiciary vessel was built to make you feel small, and it worked. The ceremonial arena was a vast circular chamber, carved from dark stone, that hummed faintly with a vibration Elliot could feel in his teeth, ringed with tiered seating that rose up into shadow, and every seat was full. Hundreds of Varkathi had come to witness the trial, warriors in bone-plate armor, and priests in robes of gold and black, and scholars with data slates, and politicians with cold, calculating eyes, and every single one of them was staring at Elliot with the same expression. This was going to be entertaining. Holographic feeds broadcast the proceedings across the entire Varkathi Empire, to military bases and colony worlds and trading posts and the great palace on the homeworld itself, because nothing like this had ever happened before, and nothing like this might ever happen again. A human had claimed the Korvan. It was absurd. It was insulting. Was impossible. And yet here he was. Elliot stood in the center of the arena floor in his worn colony clothes, with Nix pressed against his right leg. And he had never felt so exposed in his life, a small, pale figure surrounded by giants who could break him in half without trying. Across the arena floor stood Vorath Kale, the Ashkai commander, a mountain of scarred muscle and living bone plate, his burned copper eyes fixed on Elliot with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. The female judge, whose name was Irethi Khan, sat above them on a raised platform flanked by her 4 guards, and when she spoke, the arena fell silent instantly. "The right of Korvan challenge has been invoked," she said. 3 tests shall determine the truth of the bond: the severance trial, the knowledge trial, and the loyalty trial. These are the old laws, and they are absolute. She looked down at Elliot. "Do you understand what you have called upon yourself, human?" Elliot said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word, but he did not look away. "Then we begin." The first test was the severance trial. Elliot and Nix were separated and placed in sealed chambers on opposite sides of the arena. Thick-walled rooms, with no windows and no sound, and the purpose was simple. If the bond was real, then both would experience synchronized emotional distress when separated, and the judiciary's instruments would measure the intensity and determine if it met the threshold of a true Korvan. The Ashkai were confident this would end things immediately. Human emotions were a joke among the galactic species, shallow and fleeting and unstable. A species that cried at fictional stories and got attached to inanimate objects could not possibly generate the kind of deep resonant connection that a Korvan required. Vorath Kale actually smiled as the chamber doors closed. Inside his chamber, Elliot sat on the cold floor and felt the bond stretch and strain as the distance between him and Nyx grew and the walls blocked their connection. And it hurt. Not like a physical pain, but like something essential was being pulled out of his chest, one thread at a time. He thought about the cargo pod, Nyx chained in the dark, starving, alone, left to die by people who were supposed to protect her kind. And the thought made something inside him crack open, like a dam breaking. He was not going to lose her. In her chamber, Nyx felt the same thing, the bond straining and thinning, and she pressed her body against the wall closest to Elliot, and her silver veins blazed to full brightness, and she howled, a sound that the chamber walls could not fully contain, a sound of desperate, furious love that shook the instruments bolted to the ceiling. The monitoring equipment measured the resonance between them, and for 3 seconds the readings climbed steadily into the expected range for a bonded pair. Kept climbing. The numbers passed the threshold for a standard Korvan bond, and did not stop. They doubled and then tripled. And then the display screens flickered, and the instruments began to overload. Not because they were malfunctioning, but because the emotional resonance pouring through the bond was stronger than anything they had ever been designed to measure. The sensors broke. The arena went dead silent. Erethi Khan stared at the shattered instrument readings for a long moment. And when she spoke, her voice had changed. The professional detachment replaced by something that sounded almost like awe. "The bond is confirmed," she said. "It exceeds all recorded parameters." Whispers swept through the tiered seating like wind through dry grass. Because what they had just witnessed was not possible. Humans were the soft species, the weak ones, the emotional children of the galaxy, and yet this boy's connection to his wolf had just exceeded the deepest bond in Varkathi recorded history. They did not understand yet what the scholars among them were already beginning to suspect, that humans did not feel less than other species. They felt more, enormously more. Their emotions were not shallow puddles, but oceans without floors. And what the galaxy had been calling weakness for 300 years was actually the most powerful capacity for connection any living species had ever evolved. The second test was the knowledge trial. Elliot was brought back to the arena floor, and Nyx was returned to his side. And she immediately pressed against him so hard, she nearly knocked him over, her silver veins still burning bright. And through the bond, he felt her relief crash into him like a wave. Vorath Kale stepped forward for this test, because the Ashkai had spent centuries studying Varkan wolves, and he was confident that no human could match their understanding of the sacred beasts. He asked his questions with the smug precision of someone who already knew the answers. What is the optimal caloric intake for a juvenile Varkan wolf during its 3rd growth cycle? Elliot answered correctly. What are the 7 stages of bioluminescent development, and in what order do they manifest? Elliot answered correctly, and then added that recent studies suggested there were actually 8 stages, but the 8th had been misclassified as a variant of the 6th in older texts. Vorath Kale's eyes narrowed. The questions got harder and more specific, diving into obscure areas of Varkathi biology that most warriors never studied. And Elliot answered every single one, not with hesitation, but with the easy confidence of someone who had been reading about this exact subject every day for years, because he loved it. Then Vorath Kale made a mistake. He asked about the silver vein mutation, expecting Elliot to stumble, and instead Elliot took a breath and delivered a detailed explanation. That silenced the entire arena. The silver vein mutation was not a curse or an abomination. It was a rare evolutionary advancement that appeared perhaps once in 10,000 births. Silver-veined wolves had dramatically enhanced neural connectivity, which allowed for deeper and more complex bonding, faster learning, greater emotional intelligence, and a capacity for empathy that gold-veined wolves simply could not match. The HFY had not been purging corruption from the bloodline. They had been systematically killing the most gifted and extraordinary members of the species. Elliot said this while looking directly at Vorath Kale, and for the first time in the trial, the HFY commander did not have an answer. The silence in the arena was deafening. The third test was the loyalty trial. Irethi Khan explained the rules in a voice that carried no emotion, but Elliot thought he saw something in her ancient eyes that might have been concern. Be placed in a reinforced pen at the center of the arena with a full-grown Varkun Alpha, a massive male wolf with golden veins, and a documented history of aggression that had killed 3 trained Varkathi handlers over the course of its life. Elliot would be given the option to enter the pen and retrieve Nyx, or to forfeit the trial and walk away alive. If he entered, there would be no weapons, no armor, no protection of any kind. Vorath Kale was already smiling again. The pen was constructed in minutes, and the Alpha was brought in, and it was the most terrifying thing Elliot had ever seen. 5 times Nyx's size, with golden veins blazing like fire, and teeth the length of his forearm. And when it entered the pen, it immediately began pacing with the focused intensity of something that wanted very badly to kill. Nyx was placed inside, and she stood her ground, but Elliot could feel her through the bond. Not fear exactly, but a sharp awareness that she was outmatched. She was still young, still growing, and this creature could end her in seconds. The Alpha snarled, and Nyx pressed back against the pen wall, and Elliot felt her heart rate spike through the bond, and that was all it took. He walked to the pen gate. "Human," Irethi Khan said, "you understand that if you enter, you may die." "Yes," Elliot said. "You may forfeit and leave with your life." "No," Elliot said, "I cannot." He opened the gate and stepped inside. The Alpha swung its massive head toward him, and every person in the arena stopped breathing, because this small, fragile human had just walked willingly into a cage with a predator that could kill him with a single movement. Elliot walked forward until he was standing between Nyx and the Alpha, and he spread his arms, and he did not have a weapon or a plan or any real hope of surviving this. He was shaking so badly his teeth were clicking together, and his heart was beating so hard that the Varkathi monitoring systems picked it up through the arena's sensors. But he did not move. Through the bond, Nyx felt his terror, felt it like a scream in her own body. But beneath the terror, she felt something else, something that burned hotter and ran deeper than any emotion the Varkathi had ever catalogued. Humans called it love. It was not a soft thing, not gentle or quiet. It was a force, a roaring, defiant refusal to let the thing you loved be hurt, even if it meant standing in front of something that could destroy you. Even if your hands were empty, and your body was small, and every rational part of your mind was begging you to run. Nyx's silver veins erupted with light. She rose to her full height behind Elliot, and she howled. And this howl was different from any sound she had made before. It was not fear or grief or loneliness. It was a declaration, a sound that said, "I am here, and I am his, and he is mine, and you will not touch him." The Alpha, like a physical force, and the massive wolf staggered. And then something extraordinary happened. The Alpha, a creature that had killed warriors twice Elliot's size, lowered its head to the ground. It submitted. Not to Nyx alone, but to both of them, to the bond between them, because even a beast built for violence could recognize something that it had no framework to understand, but could not deny. The arena erupted. Varkathi warriors were on their feet. Scholars were shouting into their data slates. Priests were arguing with each other, and through it all, Elliot stood in the pen, with Nyx pressed against him, and his hand buried in the fur of her neck, and he was crying, but he did not care, because they had done it. They had actually done it. Irethi Khan waited for the arena to quiet, and then she delivered the ruling. "The bond is true," she said. "The Korvan between this human and this Varkan wolf is declared legitimate by the authority of the old laws and the Korvan judiciary. Let no power in the Empire challenge it." Vorath Kale's face went the color of ash. But Irethi Khan was not finished. By invoking and surviving the right of Korvan challenge, the human Elliot Vance has earned the rank of Korvan Kin, an honorary member of the Varkathi people with all the rights and protections that title carries. She paused and let the weight of her next words fill the arena. "He is the first of his species to hold this rank. He will not be the last, this I suspect." Elliot stood in the center of that vast chamber, surrounded by the most powerful warrior civilization in the galaxy. A skinny boy from a junk moon who had never won a fight in his life, and he had just done something that no human had ever done. Not with strength, not with weapons, not with power, with knowledge and empathy and a heart so full it broke every instrument they had. The news traveled faster than light. Within a day, every major species in the Galactic Concord had seen the footage. A scrawny human teenager standing with his arms spread in front of a Varkun Alpha, shaking like a leaf and refusing to move. And behind him, a silver-veined wolf blazing like a living constellation, and the sound of that howl had been replayed so many times on galactic feeds that it had become the most viewed recording in the history of interstellar media. The reactions were mixed in the way that a planet breaking in half is mixed. The Varkathi Empire was in an uproar, half of their population furious that a human had been granted Korvan kin status, and the other half quietly fascinated by what it meant, because the bonding data from the trial had been released to the scientific community, and the numbers were staggering. A human emotional resonance score that exceeded the highest Varkathi bond ever recorded by a factor of 3. Powers were having a different kind of crisis. For 300 years, the consensus had been simple. Humans were soft, humans were weak, humans were an evolutionary accident, barely worth monitoring, and the proof was in their emotions, the way they cried over stories that were not real, and formed attachments to animals and objects and ideas with an intensity that seemed irrational and childish to species who had learned to control their feelings millennia ago. Now that consensus was collapsing. If human emotional depth was not a weakness, but a strength, if their capacity for bonding was not shallow, but deeper than anything the galaxy had ever measured, then the galactic powers had been making a catastrophic miscalculation about the species sitting quietly at the bottom of their hierarchy. Diplomatic messages began flowing toward Earth at a rate that had not been seen since first contact. But Elliot was not thinking about galactic politics. On the floor of a guest chamber, aboard the judiciary vessel, eating a meal that was the first real food he had eaten in months, because he had been giving most of his rations to Nyx, and Nyx was lying beside him with her head in his lap, her silver veins pulsing with the slow, steady rhythm that meant she was content. And for the first time since he had found her in that cargo pod, he felt like maybe they were going to be okay. Mira was there too, sitting cross-legged on the opposite side of the room with a plate of alien food she was examining with deep suspicion. "This tastes like engine coolant," she said. "It is a traditional Varkathi grain preparation," Elliot said. "It tastes like fancy engine coolant," she corrected. Nyx lifted her head and made a soft chuffing sound that Elliot had learned meant she was amused, and Mira pointed at the wolf and said, "Do not laugh at me, you overgrown space dog," and Nyx chuffed again, and Mira tried to look offended. Failed. It was a good moment. The good moments did not last. Word came through the judiciary channels that Vorath Kale had vanished from the vessel during the night, and within hours, Elliot felt a spike of sharp cold dread through the bond that told him Nyx sensed danger. Close danger. The kind that was already moving toward them. The HFY commander had broken sacred law. He did not care about dishonor anymore, did not care about the right or the judiciary or the old laws. He cared only that a human had humiliated him in front of the entire empire, and that the silver-veined abomination still lived, and he intended to fix both of those problems personally. He had called in a kill squad, 4 HFY warriors loyal to him alone, smuggled aboard the vessel in a cargo shuttle, armed with weapons that the judiciary guards were not equipped to handle, because no one had ever been insane enough to attack a judiciary vessel before. Ship's night cycle. Elliot woke to Nyx on her feet, every line of her body rigid, her silver veins blazing so bright they lit the room like daylight, and through the bond he felt her fury, clean and focused and absolute. "They are here," he said, not a question. Nyx growled, a sound that started low and built until the walls vibrated. Elliot grabbed Mira and shook her awake and told her what was happening in 3 fast sentences, and Mira was on her feet and moving before he finished, because that was the kind of person she was. They could not stay in the chamber. The HFY would come there first, so they moved through the ship's corridors in the dim emergency lighting, Nyx leading with her senses spread wide, and Elliot following the map of the vessel he had memorized, because he memorized everything. He guided them toward the ship's main cargo bay, which was the largest open space on the vessel, and the place where Nyx would have room to move, because in tight corridors, even she would be at a disadvantage against armored warriors. The HFY found them there. Vorath Kale walked through the cargo bay doors, flanked by his 4 warriors, all of them in full combat armor with weapons drawn. And when he saw Elliot standing in the middle of the bay with Nyx beside him, he laughed. "The Korvankin," he said, making the title sound like a disease, standing his ground again. "Tell me, human, do you think the same trick will work twice? Do you think you can spread your little arms and make me submit like that broken alpha?" "No," Elliot said, "I do not think that at all." "Then what do you think?" "I think you do not understand what you are fighting." Vorath Kale snarled and signaled his warriors, and they moved forward in a combat formation that Elliot recognized from his datapads, a standard HFY 4-point assault pattern designed to overwhelm a single target from multiple angles. But Elliot had not just read about HFY combat formations. He had studied them obsessively for weeks while watching them patrol Dusthaven, and he knew something that Vorath Kale did not expect him to know. The 4-point pattern had a weakness. It relied on the target staying in the center, and if the target moved to the left flank during the second phase, there was a gap of exactly 2 seconds where the formation was unbalanced. Elliot did not shout commands to Nyx. He did not need to. The bond carried his intent faster than words. He simply fought, and she knew. Nyx moved. She was not the starving pup he had carried out of a scrapyard anymore. She was a Varkun wolf in her adolescent prime, faster than anything the HFY had ever hunted, and her silver veins were not a curse, they were a gift. Enhanced neural connectivity that let her process the bond's information and react in the space between heartbeats. She hit the left flank warrior at full speed, and the impact sent him crashing into the cargo bay wall hard enough to dent the metal. And before the formation could adjust, she was already moving, flowing between the warriors like dark water, with silver lightning in her veins. Elliot stayed in the center and directed through the bond, not controlling her, but guiding, feeding her the patterns he had memorized, telling her where each warrior would move next, based on their training. And Nyx used that information with a precision that made the ancient art of Varkathi warfare look clumsy. But there were still 5 of them, and 1 of her, and Vorath Kale was the most dangerous. He did not follow the standard patterns because he was beyond them. And when Nyx was engaged with 2 warriors at once, he broke through and charged straight at Elliot, with a blade that hummed with killing energy. Mira stepped out from behind a cargo stack and hit him with an EMP pulse. She had built the device in 20 minutes from components she had pulled out of cargo bay's maintenance systems, because Mira Chen could build anything from anything, and she had been very quietly working while Elliot and Nix bought her time. The pulse fried Vorath Kale's armor systems, his bone plate locking up as the living technology fused and froze, and the great warrior stumbled and fell to one knee, immobilized and helpless, and staring up at the human girl who had brought him down with a machine made from spare parts. Nix finished the remaining warriors in seconds after that, pinning them with a speed and ferocity that left them alive but unable to move. And when it was over, the cargo bay was silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing and the low hum of Nix's silver veins. Elliot walked over to Vorath Kale and looked down at him. The Ashkai commander stared up with burning hatred, but also with something new in his eyes, something that looked like the first crack in a wall that had stood for too long. "You broke the law," Elliot said, quietly. "You attacked a judiciary vessel and attempted to kill a Corvan bonded pair. That is not dishonor. That is treason." He crouched down so he was eye level with the warrior. "You could have let her live. She was just a baby with different colored veins. She was not a monster. She was not a curse. She was just different, and you chained her in a box and left her to die alone in the dark because you were afraid of what you did not understand." His voice did not shake this time. "I was afraid too. I am afraid of everything all the time, but I have learned something that you never did. Being afraid does not mean you stop caring. It means the caring matters more." The judiciary guards arrived minutes later, alerted by the commotion, and Vorath Kale and his warriors were taken into custody. Within a week, the investigation had expanded. The evidence from Nix's memories, verified by the judiciary's bonding technology, exposed the Varkathi High Lord had ordered her death, and the political earthquake that followed brought down one of the oldest houses in the Empire. The Ashkai sect was formally condemned and disbanded. Nix's mother, the golden-veined female from the palace on the homeworld, was found alive, and when she was told that her silver-veined daughter had survived and bonded with a human, she made a sound that the Varkathi scholars recorded and studied for years afterward, because it was a sound of joy so deep it had no name in their language. In the weeks that followed, Elliot received an invitation that would have seemed like a hallucination 6 months ago, a formal offer of enrollment at the Varkathi Academy of Bonded Warfare, the most prestigious institution in the Empire, a place that had never once in its entire existence admitted a non-Varkathi student. He accepted, but he had one condition: Dusthaven, his colony, the Junk Moon settlement where he had grown up forgotten and overlooked, would be granted full Varkathi trade protection, access to their markets, their technology, their shipping lanes, everything it needed to stop being a place where people came to disappear and start being a place where people could actually build something. The Varkathi agreed, because they were beginning to understand that saying no to Elliot Vance was a mistake that kept getting more expensive. On his last night on Callan 4, Elliot stood in the scrapyard where everything had started, in front of the rusted cargo pod where he had found a dying baby wolf 3 months and a lifetime ago. Nix stood beside him, tall and strong, her black fur rippling in the cold wind, and her silver veins casting pale light across the twisted metal. And she pressed her head against his hip, the same way she had pressed her nose against his chest on the night they met. Through the bond he felt everything she felt, gratitude and loyalty, and a fierce protective love that was as vast and deep as the space between stars. He felt the same thing back, and he knew she felt it too. The next morning, he boarded the Varkathi cruiser with Mira, who had been offered a position in the Academy's engineering division and had accepted with the words, "Someone has to keep you alive," and Nix, who walked up the boarding ramp with the calm authority of a creature who knew exactly where she belonged. On the observation deck, as the ship pulled away from Callan 4 and the junk moon shrank to a gray dot behind them, a Varkathi diplomat watched the boy and his wolf standing together at the viewport and turned to a colleague. "How did we overlook their species for so long?" the diplomat asked. The colleague, a Varkathi scholar who had been present at the trial, and who had watched a human boy walk into a cage with an alpha and refuse to move, answered quietly. "Because we measured strength in claws and teeth. We never thought to measure it in the size of a glove." Heart. Nyx made a low rumbling sound and pressed closer to Elliot's side, and her silver veins glowed warm and steady in the light of 1,000 stars. Elliot scratched behind her ears and smiled, the same awkward, lopsided smile he had always had, the smile of a boy who still could not believe any of this was real. But it was real. A nerdy kid from a junk moon had found a chained baby wolf left to die, and when he approached her, he realized that the galaxy had been wrong about both of them. She was not a monster, and he was not weak, and together they were something the universe had never seen before. The stars stretched out ahead of them, infinite and waiting, and Elliot Vance, the boy nobody noticed, walked toward them with a wolf made of starlight at his side, and the whole galaxy finally paying attention. They were just getting started.